She stood by the coffee pot in her flight suit, dismissed as admin staff by a junior officer who refused to see her rank or wings. Then the Admiral walked in and spoke one word, her call sign. In that instant, the room went silent and everything changed. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The coffee pot hissed softly in the corner of the secure briefing room. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell stood beside it, pouring herself a cup. Her green flight suit was crisp and clean, the fabric still holding the sharp creases from this morning's ironing. On her left chest, just above her heart, a set of golden wings caught the fluorescent light. They were slightly worn at the edges, the gold thread frayed from years of use. The briefing room was cold and sterile. No windows. No decorations. Just gray walls, a long mahogany table, and rows of high-backed leather chairs. This was a SCIF, a sensitive compartmented information facility. The kind of room where secrets were discussed and decisions were made that could change the course of wars. Senior officers were filing in. Air Force colonels. Marine majors. Navy captains. They moved with the quiet confidence of men and women who had seen combat and lived to tell about it. Some nodded at Sarah. Others didn't seem to notice her at all. She was used to that. Sarah had learned a long time ago that being a female fighter pilot meant you were either invisible or under a microscope. There was rarely any middle ground. Today, it seemed, she was invisible. That was fine. She preferred it that way. Less drama. Less attention. Just let her do her job. She finished pouring her coffee and was about to find her seat when a voice cut through the low murmur of conversation. "Excuse me, ma'am." Sarah turned. A young lieutenant stood in front of her. He couldn't have been more than 25 years old. His uniform was perfect. Too perfect. Every ribbon was aligned. Every crease was knife-sharp. His shoes gleamed like black mirrors. He had the look of someone who had just graduated from the Naval Academy and was eager to prove himself. "Yes," Sarah said, her voice neutral. "This briefing is for attendees only," the lieutenant said. He held up his hand, palm out, like he was stopping traffic. "Spouses and admin staff need to wait outside." Sarah blinked. For a moment, she wasn't sure she had heard him correctly. "I'm sorry," she said. "The briefing," the lieutenant repeated, speaking a little slower now, as if she might not understand English. "It's classified. Top secret. Sigh. You need a special clearance to be in here. If you're waiting for someone, there's a lounge down the hall." Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. Not anger. Not yet. Just a weary kind of sadness. She had been through this before. Too many times. She glanced down at her flight suit. At the rank insignia on her collar. Lieutenant Commander. Oh, 4. At the golden wings on her chest. Naval Aviator. At the patch on her shoulder. Strike Fighter Squadron 87, the Golden Warriors. The lieutenant followed her gaze, but his expression didn't change. He saw the uniform. He saw the insignia. But he didn't see her. He saw a woman standing by the coffee pot, and his brain filled in the rest of the story. "I am an attendee, Lieutenant," Sarah said quietly. The young officer's jaw tightened. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see your credentials." Around the table, conversation stopped. Heads turned. The other officers were watching now, their expressions ranging from curiosity to discomfort. An Air Force colonel, a woman with silver hair and eagles on her shoulders, shook her head slowly. Sarah reached into the shoulder pocket of her flight suit and pulled out her common access card. She held it out without a word. The lieutenant took it. His fingers brushed hers. He looked at the card, and for just a second, confusion flickered across his face. LCDR Mitchell, Sarah J. Lieutenant Commander. Oh, 4. He was an O2. A lieutenant junior grade. She outranked him by 2 full pay grades. He should have stopped right there. He should have handed the card back with an apology and walked away. But he didn't. Instead, he held the card up to the light, squinting at it like he suspected it might be fake. There have been a lot of admin errors lately, he muttered. Cards get mixed up during transfer season. I've seen it happen. Sarah said nothing. She just stood there, her coffee cup in one hand, waiting. The lieutenant walked over to a security terminal near the door. He slid her card into the reader and began typing. The screen glowed. His fingers moved across the keyboard with exaggerated precision, like he was performing brain surgery instead of checking a database. A Marine gunnery sergeant standing guard by the entrance watched the exchange. His face was blank, but his eyes told a different story. He had seen this before. He knew how it would end. It says here your naval aviation, the lieutenant said, staring at the screen. He turned to look at Sarah, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Public affairs, I assume. Or maybe meteorology. They issue flight suits to a lot of support roles these days. The insult was precise. Deliberate. He wasn't just questioning her presence. He was questioning her profession. He was telling her, and everyone else in the room, that even if she was an officer, she wasn't a real pilot. Not one of the ones who mattered. Sarah's gaze drifted down to the wings on her chest. They were slightly faded now, the gold threads worn thin from the constant rubbing of survival vests and parachute harnesses. She had earned those wings 5 years ago at Naval Air Station Kingsville. She remembered the ceremony. The pride. The relief. The sheer exhaustion. But the wings weren't just about passing a test. They were about everything that came after. For a moment, the sterile briefing room disappeared. Sarah was back in the cockpit of her F/A-18 Super Hornet, strapped into the ejection seat, feeling the violent lurch as the catapult launched her off the deck of the USS Theodore Roosevelt. 0 to 165 miles per hour in less than 2 seconds. The G-forces crushing her into her seat. Her vision narrowing to a tunnel. Her hands steady on the stick. She remembered night landings. Coming back to the carrier after a mission, fuel running low, the deck pitching and rolling in heavy seas. No moon. No horizon. Just the faint glow of the ship's lights and the voice of the landing signal officer in her headset, calm and steady, guiding her home. She remembered the fear. The constant, gnawing fear that lived in the pit of her stomach every time she strapped into the jet. The fear that she would make a mistake. That she would miss the wire. That she would crash into the back of the ship or go into the water. But she had learned to control that fear. To master it. To push it down into a small, dark corner of her mind and focus on the mission. That was what those wings represented. Not just skill. But courage. Discipline. Trust. The lieutenant's voice cut through her thoughts. So, Commander, he said, loading the title with sarcasm, your clearance for this specific briefing isn't showing up in the system. It's probably an admin error, but I can't let you stay without proper authorization. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. He walked back over and held out her CAC card. His expression was smug. Self-satisfied. He thought he was doing his job. Protecting security. Following protocol. If you refuse, he added, I'll have to call security. And we can also discuss the unauthorized wear of aviation insignia. The room went silent. Completely, utterly silent. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to fade away. The accusation hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. Unauthorized wear of insignia. That was more than an insult. It was an accusation of fraud. Of dishonor. Of stolen valor. Sarah felt something crack inside her. Not anger. Not rage. Just a deep, bone-tired sadness. She had flown combat missions over Syria. She had dodged surface-to-air missiles. She had landed on a carrier deck in a thunderstorm with one engine flamed out and hydraulics failing. And now, standing in a climate-controlled briefing room surrounded by her peers, she was being accused of wearing a costume. Before she could respond, the main doors to the briefing room burst open. Every officer in the room shot to their feet. Chairs scraped. Papers rustled. Backs straightened. Standing in the doorway was Rear Admiral James Cartwright. 2 stars gleamed on his collar. His uniform was immaculate. His face was stern. Flanking him were his aide, a sharp-eyed captain, and the Fleet Master Chief, a man whose chest was so covered in ribbons it looked like a quilt. The 3 men didn't walk into the room. They owned it. The air itself seemed to shift around them. The young lieutenant froze. His face went pale. The smug confidence drained out of him like water from a broken glass. He still held Sarah's CAC card in his hand, but now his fingers were trembling. Admiral Cartwright's eyes swept the room. He took in the scene instantly. The officers standing at attention. The terrified lieutenant. And Sarah, standing alone by the coffee station, her posture rigid, her face carefully blank. The admiral didn't look at the lieutenant. He walked right past him, his gaze locked on Sarah. He stopped directly in front of her. The stars on his shoulders seemed to glow under the lights. The silence in the room was absolute. No one moved. No one breathed. And then, Admiral Cartwright smiled. It was a small smile, but it was warm. Genuine. "Viper," he said quietly. The call sign echoed in the stillness. "Viper." The lieutenant flinched like he'd been slapped. Around the table, several officers exchanged glances. Recognition dawned on their faces. They knew that name. They knew the stories. Admiral Cartwright turned to address the room, his voice rising to a command tone. "For those of you who haven't had the honor," he began, "let me introduce Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell. Call sign, Viper." He paused, letting the name sink in. Commander Mitchell has over 800 carrier landings. More than 200 of those were at night. She has flown over 150 combat missions in support of Operation Inherent Resolve. She was the lead pilot on the strike package that destroyed the ISIS command center outside Mosul, a mission that saved countless civilian lives. With each sentence, the lieutenant seemed to shrink. His face was now the color of paper. "She is a Top Gun graduate," the admiral continued. "She is a qualified landing signal officer. And last year, when her wingman's aircraft was hit by ground fire over Syria, she stayed with him. She talked him through an emergency landing at an austere airfield in hostile territory. She circled overhead, low on fuel, covering him until rescue arrived. For that, she was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross." The admiral turned back to Sarah. His posture shifted. He was no longer a commanding officer addressing his staff. He was one warrior honoring another. He brought his hand up in a crisp salute. "Welcome to the briefing, Commander," he said. "Your expertise on low-altitude strike tactics is exactly what we need today." Sarah's back straightened. The exhaustion in her eyes was replaced by something fierce and bright. She returned the salute with equal precision. "Thank you, Admiral," she said. "Happy to be here." The vindication was complete. Public. Undeniable. Admiral Cartwright then let his gaze fall on the young lieutenant. The warmth drained from his face. His voice dropped to a low, cold tone. "Lieutenant," he said. The young officer flinched. "Report to my office at 1500 hours with your commanding officer. You and I are going to have a very long conversation about respect, professionalism, and the Navy's core values. I suggest you spend the time between now and then reflecting on what those words actually mean." The Admiral plucked Sarah's CAC card from the lieutenant's numb fingers and handed it back to her. "Carry on," he said to the room. Then he walked to the head of the table and sat down. His aide and the Master Chief took seats on either side of him. The rest of the officers slowly sat as well, the tension draining from the room like air from a balloon. Sarah walked calmly to an empty seat near the middle of the table. She set her coffee down, pulled out a notepad, and clicked her pen. Ready to work. The lieutenant stood frozen by the door for a long moment. Then, moving like a man in a dream, he turned and walked out. The door closed softly behind him. The briefing began. 3 weeks later, Sarah was in the base gym. She had just finished a run on the treadmill and was stretching when she heard a voice behind her. "Commander Mitchell." She turned. The young lieutenant stood a few feet away. He was in PT gear, a navy t-shirt and shorts. Without the uniform, he looked younger. Smaller. "Lieutenant," Sarah said, her tone neutral. He swallowed hard. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say. I'm sorry. What I did in that briefing room was wrong. It was unprofessional and disrespectful. There's no excuse for it." His voice was shaking. He looked like he might be sick. "I've been reassigned," he continued. "I'm moving to a logistics billet. But before I left, I wanted to apologize. To your face. You didn't deserve that." Sarah studied him for a moment. She saw genuine remorse in his eyes. And something else. Humility. "We all make mistakes, Lieutenant," she said quietly. "What matters is what we learn from them." He nodded. "I've learned, ma'am. I promise." "Good," Sarah said. She turned back to her stretching, then paused. "Lieutenant?" "Yes, ma'am. Next time you see a uniform, look at the rank. Look at the insignia. Don't look at the person wearing it and make assumptions. Every officer in the Navy earned their place. Respect that." "I will, ma'am." He started to walk away, then stopped. "Commander," he said. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah looked at him. "What's it like?" he asked. "Flying off a carrier. At night." Sarah was quiet for a moment. She thought about the darkness. The fear. The violence of the catapult launch and the controlled crash of the landing. She thought about the trust it required. Trust in your training. Trust in your aircraft. Trust in the ship and the crew. "It's terrifying," she said honestly. "Every single time. But it's also the most incredible thing you'll ever do. Because when you trap on that deck in the middle of the night, when you shut down the engines and climb out of the cockpit, you know you've done something that only a handful of people in the world can do. And that makes all the fear worth it." The lieutenant nodded slowly. "Thank you, ma'am." He walked away, and Sarah went back to her stretching. 2 months after the incident, Admiral Cartwright held a command-wide training session on unconscious bias and respect in the workplace. He used the briefing room incident as a case study, though he kept the names anonymous. "We all carry assumptions," he told the assembled officers. "We all make snap judgments based on what we see. But in the military, we can't afford to let those assumptions cloud our judgment. We are judged by our rank, our qualifications, and our performance. Not by our gender. Not by our race. Not by what someone thinks we should be." He paused, looking around the room. Every officer in this room has earned their place. They've passed the same tests. Met the same standards. When you see a uniform, respect it. When you see rank insignia, honor it. And when you see wings, remember that the person wearing them has done something extraordinary. The message was clear. The Navy was changing. Slowly. Painfully. But it was changing. 6 months later, Sarah was sitting in the ready room of Strike Fighter Squadron 87 aboard the USS Theodore Roosevelt. The ship was deployed to the Mediterranean, and the squadron was flying daily missions in support of Allied forces. Sarah was the squadron's operations officer now, responsible for planning and coordinating all flight operations. It was a demanding job, but she loved it. A young female pilot, fresh from flight school, approached her nervously. "Ma'am," the pilot said. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course," Sarah said. "How do you deal with it?" the pilot asked. "The assumptions. The comments. The way some people look at you like you don't belong." Sarah set down the mission brief she had been reading. She looked at the young pilot and saw herself 5 years ago. Nervous. Uncertain. Desperate to prove herself. "You just keep flying," Sarah said. "You keep doing your job. You keep meeting the standard. And eventually, people stop seeing your gender. They start seeing your wings. They start seeing your skill. Your professionalism. Your dedication." She paused. "It's not fair that we have to work harder to prove ourselves," she continued. "It's not fair that we're judged more harshly. But that's the reality. So you take that reality and you turn it into fuel. You use it to make yourself better. Stronger. Sharper." The young pilot nodded. "And remember," Sarah added, "you're not just flying for yourself. You're flying for every woman who will come after you. You're proving that we belong in the cockpit. That we can handle the pressure. That we can do the job just as well as anyone else." The pilot straightened her shoulders. "Yes, ma'am." "Good," Sarah said. "Now go pre-flight your aircraft. We launch in 2 hours." The pilot saluted and walked away, her steps a little more confident than before. Sarah watched her go and felt a surge of pride. The Navy was changing. One flight at a time. That night, Sarah stood on the flight deck of the carrier, watching the sun set over the Mediterranean. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink and purple. The sea was calm, the surface glittering like broken glass. In a few hours, she would be back in the cockpit. Back in the darkness. Back in the fear and the violence and the controlled chaos of carrier aviation. But right now, in this moment, she was at peace. She thought about the briefing room. About the young lieutenant who had looked at her and seen only a woman by the coffee pot. She thought about Admiral Cartwright, who had looked at her and seen a warrior. She thought about all the flights she had flown. All the missions she had completed. All the nights she had landed on this deck in the darkness, guided only by the lights and the voice of the LSO and her own skill and courage. Those wings on her chest weren't just a decoration. They were a promise. A commitment. A sacred trust. She had earned them. Every single day, she proved she deserved them. And no one, could ever take that away from her. Sarah turned and walked back inside the ship. She had a brief to prepare. A mission to plan. A job to do. She was Viper. She was a naval aviator. She was a United States Navy officer. And she was exactly where she belonged. 5 years passed. Sarah was now a full commander, wearing the oak leaves of an O-5 on her collar. She had completed her squadron tour and moved on to bigger responsibilities. She was now the executive officer of an air wing, second in command of all aviation operations for an entire carrier strike group. The incident in the briefing room had become something of a legend in naval aviation circles. Not because of the confrontation itself, but because of what happened afterward. Admiral Cartwright had turned it into a teaching moment. The story was now used in leadership courses at the Naval Academy and in officer training programs across the fleet. Sarah rarely talked about it. When asked, she would simply say that it was a learning experience for everyone involved, including herself. She had learned that grace under pressure was just as important as courage in combat. That sometimes the hardest battles weren't fought in the sky, but in quiet rooms where assumptions and biases held more power than missiles and guns. The young lieutenant who had confronted her that day had actually turned his career around. After his reassignment to logistics, he had thrown himself into his work with humility and dedication. He had learned to listen more and assume less. He had sought out mentors, including several female officers, and had become an advocate for diversity and inclusion in his command. 3 years after the incident, he had written Sarah a letter. In it, he thanked her for her grace and for not ending his career when she easily could have. He told her that the lesson he learned that day had made him a better officer and a better person. He was now a full lieutenant, serving with distinction, and he credited that terrible day in the briefing room with saving him from a lifetime of blind prejudice. Sarah had kept the letter. It reminded her that people could change. That mistakes, even terrible ones, didn't have to define a person forever. One crisp autumn morning, Sarah found herself back at the Naval Academy in Annapolis. She had been invited to speak to the senior class, the first ties who would soon graduate and receive their commissions as ensigns. She stood at the podium in Alumni Hall, looking out at hundreds of young faces. Some were eager. Some were nervous. Some were probably just trying to stay awake after a long night of studying. When I was sitting where you are, Sarah began, I thought I knew what the Navy would be like. I thought I knew what challenges I would face. I was wrong. She paused, letting the words sink in. The hardest challenges I faced weren't the ones I expected. Yes, learning to land on a carrier at night was terrifying. Yes, flying combat missions was dangerous. Yes, the long deployments away from family were difficult. But those challenges were the ones I had trained for. The ones I was prepared for. She walked out from behind the podium, making the speech more personal. The challenges that surprised me were the ones that came from within. From people who looked at me and made assumptions. From colleagues who questioned whether I belonged. From a system that sometimes seemed designed for someone else. A few midshipmen shifted in their seats. They knew what she was talking about. Especially the women. Especially the minorities. But here's what I learned, Sarah continued. Those challenges made me stronger. They forced me to be better. Not just as a pilot, but as an officer. As a leader. As a person. She told them about the briefing room. Not to embarrass anyone, but to illustrate a point. She told them about standing there with her coffee, being told she didn't belong. She told them about Admiral Cartwright and how he had defended her honor. But the most important part of that story, she said, isn't what the Admiral did. It's what happened after. That young lieutenant could have become bitter. He could have blamed everyone else. Instead, he took responsibility. He learned. He grew. And now he's a good officer who treats everyone with respect. She looked around the room. Some of you will face similar challenges. You'll be underestimated. Dismissed. Told you don't belong. And in those moments, you have a choice. You can let it break you, or you can let it forge you into something stronger. Sarah's voice grew stronger, more passionate. But here's my challenge to all of you, especially those who won't face these kinds of barriers. When you see someone being underestimated, stand up for them. When you see assumptions being made, challenge them. When you see unfairness, call it out. Don't wait for an admiral to walk into the room. Be the person who makes it right. The room was absolutely silent. Every eye was on her. Leadership isn't just about giving orders, Sarah said. It's about creating an environment where every sailor, every Marine, every officer can do their best work. Where people are judged by their performance, not by assumptions. Where the only thing that matters is whether you can do the job. She returned to the podium. In a few months, you'll pin on your ensign bars. You'll take command of sailors. Some of them will be older than you. More experienced than you. They'll be watching to see what kind of leader you'll be. Will you be the kind who makes assumptions? Or will you be the kind who sees people for who they really are? Sarah's final words were firm and clear. The Navy is changing. You are the ones who will lead that change. You have the power to make it a place where everyone who earns their wings, their dolphins, their warfare pins, is respected and valued. Don't waste that power. Don't squander that opportunity. She stepped back from the podium. Fair winds and following seas to all of you. Make us proud. The applause started slowly, then built like thunder. The midshipmen rose to their feet, clapping and cheering. Some of the female midshipmen had tears in their eyes. After the speech, dozens of midshipmen lined up to talk to her. They asked about flying. About leadership. About how to handle challenges. Sarah stayed for over 2 hours, answering every question, shaking every hand. A young woman, a first-tie who would graduate in a few months, was last in line. "Ma'am," she said quietly, "I want to be a pilot. But I'm scared. Not of flying. Of everything else." Sarah looked at her and saw herself 20 years ago. "What's your name?" Sarah asked. "Midshipman First Class Rodriguez, ma'am." "Listen to me, Rodriguez," Sarah said. "The fear never goes away. Not completely. But you don't let it stop you. You acknowledge it, and then you do the job anyway. That's what courage is. Not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it." Rodriguez nodded, her jaw set with determination. "And remember," Sarah added, "you won't be alone. There are more of us now than when I started. We look out for each other. We lift each other up. You'll have sisters in the sky." "Thank you, ma'am," Rodriguez said. "I won't let you down." "You won't," Sarah said with certainty. "I can see it in your eyes. You have what it takes." That evening, as Sarah flew back to her duty station, she reflected on how far she had come. From that terrifying first carrier landing to commander of operations for an entire air wing. From being invisible to being a voice for change. The briefing room incident had been a turning point, not just for her, but for many others. It had sparked conversations. Changed policies. Opened eyes. But the work wasn't finished. There were still barriers to break. Still assumptions to challenge. Still young officers who needed mentors and advocates. Sarah thought about Midshipman Rodriguez and all the other young women who would follow in her footsteps. They would face their own challenges. Their own briefing room moments. But they would also have something she didn't have when she started, a path that had been cleared, at least in part, by those who came before. And one day, those young women would clear the path even further for the generation after them. That was the real legacy. Not the medals. Not the awards. Not even the missions. The legacy was in the people you inspired. The barriers you broke. The culture you changed. Sarah smiled as the aircraft climbed through the clouds. Somewhere below, a young lieutenant who had once made a terrible mistake was serving with honor, teaching others to see beyond their assumptions. Somewhere ahead, a young midshipman was dreaming of flight school, her fear tempered by determination. And somewhere in between, Sarah Mitchell, call sign Viper, was exactly where she was meant to be. Flying forward. Breaking barriers. Leading the way.